Well, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. Um, all I have to say is you guys must not have a life because you're spending the night coming listening to me. But hopefully I don't waste your time here. You know, talking about a subject like this is kind of an interesting one because we really have to look at intent. You know, if we don't look at the intent of people who participate in the events that we study, we're missing a huge part. Remember, context is everything. Why did people do this? Why did they act this way? Did they mean for it to turn out the way it did? And so in last week's program, or not last week's, but the last program we had here, it was about the schools, the boarding schools, and the pitfalls and the pretty terrible repercussions of forced assimilation. And so tonight I'm going to be talking about why did these people push for assimilation? What was the goal here? And as I talk about this, I'm in no way trying to make light of what people experience and the suffering that accompanied that assimilation. But what happened really was inexcusable, and but we just need to understand why people did what they did. And as we start to understand that, we really start to understand the Modoc War and its national significance, and the effect that national policy was having on the Modoc War and events here. So lots of times when we look at history in the past, we like to think of events, well, this happened and this happened, kind of an A to B type thing. But the more you dig into the past, it ends up being something that's more like one of these koosh balls, where you have like endless bits going into a single point. And that's really more what it's like. You can approach historical events from many points, and there are different perspectives on every one of those that help us gain greater understanding of what was actually going on in the past. So I'm going to start off by talking about early Indian policies back in the day. So, and a lot of these Indian policies were based on the assumption from Euro-Americans that indigenous cultures were incompatible with general civilization, or to put it simpler, European civilization. And so there were very few attempts to try and mix. The French tried that for a while, were fairly successful about blending the cultures together. But the English, Spanish, they were not in too much of a hurry to mix cultures. And so the natural thing to do then would be to remove the tribes out of the way of where you're trying to go. So with early British policies, that's what you see. And they established a line more or less in the Appalachians, but as the colonists expanded westwards, they kept blowing up those boundaries that the British were putting in place. And so you see removal more and more of a repeated option there. You hear about the Trail of Tears that happened later on. What this is just you're moving the tribes out of the way. You don't want to mix with them. You don't want them in where you're going. We're just going to move them somewhere else where you don't want to go. But also in that same time period of removal, you have the Trade and Intercourse Acts. And those acts were set in place to prevent whites from encroaching on Native American lands and doing trading with them without federal authorization. Now, the problem with this is that was whether the government was incapable of enforcing it or whether they were just reluctant or unwilling to enforce it is a different story, but they were not enforced very strictly. And so even though these were trying to make things better in terms of relations, it just did not work. And so later on, you have the development of the reservation system. where tribes would be put onto reservations throughout the nation. And that's something that comes in later on, more in the 1850s, especially 1850s and into the 1860s. So moving on here, let's talk about, oh, it didn't go here. There we are. So let's talk about the reservation system a little bit more. So these were brought about through negotiations with the tribes. And so you would deal with the tribes as a sovereign nation. That means you're going in there with diplomats, you're going in there with ambassadors to make these deals. Those people who would usually go in to make those deals on behalf of the government were Indian agents and superintendents of Indian affairs of the states or territories. And they would create these treaties. And these treaties would usually designate a place where the tribes had to go. And it was almost always away from where the whites were going, in the undesirable parts. And these treaties often had stipulations where the government would be offering food and money, goods, and implements so the farm. But there was almost always a set period of time. The other part was to educate the tribes and help them adapt to white ways. And we talked about that last month about boarding schools. But boarding schools weren't really a thing at this point in the early reservation system. That came later on in the late 1870s, early 1880s. That's when the boarding schools really started up. What these schools would be like is smaller schools placed on the reservations. They'd bring in teachers from other parts of the country, and they would have students come in, and whether it was daily or weekly, they'd work to start that assimilation process. But there were a few issues in terms of corruption when it came to the reservation system. I shouldn't say a few issues, there were a lot. But first and foremost, the government made money off the reservation system. We need to make that clear. That's something that doesn't get talked about a whole lot, because a lot of times we just think, oh, the settlers would go in and get the land. But no, the government made a killing on this. What would happen is they would either sell the land to settlers, or they would wait for the settlers to settle in place and then have whether it's taxes or economic benefits of so the government was really making a killing off of this. And it really became, the whole system became corrupt really fast. There were people who would go in there, they'd skim goods that were promised to the tribes, they'd take them for themselves and sell to the whites. They'd take the money that was promised to them for themselves. And really, it was a broken system fairly quickly. So now let's talk about the Treaty of 1864. So previous to this, I think we, as Clint shared a few months ago in his presentation on the Modoc War, the Modocs tried to make a deal with Elijah Steele in Wairika. And the problem with that treaty is that it just didn't. Steele had no authority to do what he was doing. And even though the treaty, we look back at it and think, you know, that would have been a pretty Modocs. It was rejected. It wasn't even considered on the part of the government. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs sent J.W. Parent Huntington to go and work out that treaty. You know, J.W. Parent Huntington was the superintendent of Indian Affairs in Oregon. He was also a member of the Applegate family by marriage. He was the son-in-law of Charles Applegate, brother of Lindsay Applegate, the first agent on the reservation here. And they made the reservation where the Modocs didn't get any of their homeland. They all had to go up to where the Klamaths were. And of course, like any other treaty, they had certain stipulations that the government had to fulfill, such as feeding them, giving them farm implements, educating them. And One of the signers of the treaty was Kinquosh, or Captain Jack. And if you look here, I'll zoom in on this a little bit. I guess I didn't zoom much, but what I circled right there on that is where he made his X mark on the treaty. But when all of this was going on, any idea what was going on in 1864? Much bigger. Yeah, the deadliest war in American history. And so you had Americans killing each other by the hundreds of thousands. And to top it all off, well, I guess that's not topping off, it gets worse. So President Lincoln his attention was pretty much all on the war. What happened with Indian affairs, he just didn't care. It was not something he was concerned about. In fact, there was they call it the Great Sioux Uprising in Minnesota. And the Sioux who were living in Minnesota had been getting starved. They weren't getting their supplies that they were supposed to receive. And so they started retaliating against their agent, and a lot of them went on the warpath and killed quite a few whites. And Lincoln, in response to all this, he sent a message to the governor of Minnesota and said, "Deal with the Indians. Necessity knows no law." And so what ended up happening was the uprising was put down, and 38 of the natives were executed by hanging. So you had a distracted president and a distracted nation. Meanwhile, you had a lot of the funds that were bound for Oregon, for Indian affairs in Oregon, sailing on the ship, the Brother Jonathan. And the Brother Jonathan was a pretty famous ship on the West Coast. And some of the passengers were really famous people, such as General George Wright. But there was an issue there with that when it decided to become underwater archaeological site. So it crashed into a rock in outside Crescent City. And
Bill Lewis asked that you share your screen.
Share my screen? Oh, okay. I'm sorry. There we go. Sorry about that. Oops. Okay. So maybe jump ahead here. So there goes the ship. But after that, after the Civil War ended, there's still another huge draw on national attention. So you had Reconstruction. Almost all the nation's resources were going into the South and rebuilding the South and trying to reinstate the laws of the United States there. And so it took a long time for that treaty of 1864 to be ratified. It wasn't finalized until 1870, so 6 years afterwards. And so meanwhile, again, the Brother Jonathan that had all the money bound for the tribes here sank. So no money. And then also the treaty isn't ratified, so the supplies are just not making it here. Nothing is making it here. And so you see. So here on the reservation, of course, the Modocs and the people from other tribes are just really not happy about the way things are going. And you'll see here in a report from Lindsay Applegate to Huntington, where he says, I became convinced at this time of a growing disaffection among the Indians on account of the tardiness of the government in fulfilling the treaty stipulations. And I give as my opinion in a communication address to your office that something should be done by the government as soon as possible to inspire the Indians with proper confidence in it. So the tribes are losing confidence in any promises they're being given. And before anything can be done, Captain Jack is gone. He leaves. He would rather live off the reservation, take his chances than starve. Now, jumping ahead a little bit to 1867, the government authorized what was called the Doolittle Commission. And the purpose of this commission was to go around and try and figure out how can national Indian policy be fixed? We know it's corrupt. What can we do to fix this? And if you look closely here, there are a few famous people. One of them, the circled one on the left, is William Tecumseh Sherman, General Sherman. And the one on the right was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Nathaniel Taylor. Now, Nathaniel Taylor and Sherman really butted heads. They did not get along. And Sherman said, what I've seen here is proof that what's going on with the Bureau of Indian Affairs is utterly a mess, and it is corrupt, and it needs to be transferred to the War Department. The Army will take care of this and do it right. And Nathaniel Taylor said, no, there's ways we can fix this peaceably without transferring it to the War Department. Just on a side note, over here to the left of Sherman, this guy right here is the namesake of Harney, William S. Harney. He was given the nickname. So you had this massive tug of war, and sorry, the box here is kind of covering. Let me see if I can use this. I'll put it in between.
There's like a line on.
Oh, right there.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. So, kind of like I was saying, the Army wanted control of Indian affairs and said that corruption led to wars, that wars would not happen. The Army would not have to go in and do any killing or dying if the corruption was rooted out of the Indian Department. But the politicians like Nathaniel Taylor wanted the control to remain with the civilian part of the government, saying that, why would we hand all over Indian affairs over to the Army when their whole business is killing? And so there's this massive, massive tug of war going on. And at the time, you have a new president show up. And this is the inauguration here. You zoom in. Anybody tell who that is there? $50 bill. That's Ulysses S. Grant. That's him giving his inaugural address there. Yeah. So yeah, he's a fairly skinny guy. He put on some weight afterwards, but he surprised everyone massively when he got up in his address and seemingly out of the blue, he said, the matter of Indian affairs is one that needs attention. And I will support anything that leads to their citizenship as soon as possible. And it really blew people out of the water. People were not expecting it. So, and Grant was sympathetic towards it. He had had some experiences with them. One thing that he told a member of a group of Quakers back in the day, soon around the time of his inauguration, he said, I do not believe our Creator ever placed different races of men on this earth with the view of having the stronger exert all his energies in exterminating the weaker. And so also, we can talk about him a little bit more here. So he'd been a career soldier for a time and had served in many parts of the West, including California, Oregon, and Washington. And while he was there, he really got to know a lot of the local tribes and natives. And so once he became president, that became one of his main pillars of his policy, was fairness for the tribes, citizenship for the tribes. If they get citizenship, they will be able to be fully functional members of society and they cannot be deprived of their rights. So here's a few quotes that he said from earlier on in his war years. This is before he became president, the first two. He said, the decimation among the Indians I knew of personally. He had seen the effects that that disease had on the tribes. He had seen of culture and that had come through the vices that whites had been passing on to the tribes. And he also said, my opinion is that the whole race would be harmless and peaceable if they were not put upon by whites. So he's saying all the problems are coming from whites. This is not a problem that the Indians are causing. This is a problem that whites are causing. And so he told a delegation of Quakers, and this became one of his slogans. He told them, let us have peace, speaking of the tribe. He also said something similar to that effect for the South. But so this is something completely radical in terms of presidents and Indian policy. Now let's take a look at here. This is probably the most radical thing of all that he did. One of his assistants and a good friend of his was, let's see here. Can you see him there on the right? Was a Seneca Indian. One of his assistants in the war, Nonehogawa, or Eli Parker. Grant had Eli Parker write the terms of surrender that General Lee signed to end the war. And Grant had a lot of confidence in him. And I think it would be safe to say that a lot of Grant's ideas on giving Native citizenship came from his experiences and friendship with Eli Parker. So Grant made Eli Parker the, did I miss? Okay. So Grant made Eli Parker the first Native American Commissioner of Indian Affairs. If anybody can help rectify the situation in the Department of Indian Affairs, it is another Indian. So Eli Parker assumed that role. But at the same time, Grant was trying to figure out, okay, what should we do policy-wise for the tribes? And so he pushed for a bill that would create a board of Indian commissioners. Now, the purpose of this board was to for oversight. They would look at the different reservations and the different agencies across the United States. And they would try and see what's going on here, what's wrong. You see, the Doolittle Commission had done that years before, but they came out of it at odds with each other. And so it's time to try and figure out again, okay, what can we do with this? And so they started visiting reservations in 1869, the year after Grant was inaugurated. And they were given a set of questions that they needed to determine. First is, what should the legal status of natives be? Should treaties still continue to be used? Should that be part of our dealings with them? Should tribes be placed on reservation? If so, how? Can fraud among agents be ended? And at what point should the military ever get involved? Should they get involved, period? So the year after, the commission came back, and here were some of their findings. They said the white man has been the chief obstacle in the way of Indian civilization. It's like the whites are impeding this whole thing on their own. It's not the fault of the natives, it is the fault of the whites. And treaty making should be abandoned, but its existing stipulations should be fulfilled. Now, the reason for abandoning treaty making is that we're making all these promises and they're just not being kept. To do better, there needs to be some other way to be good and just to the tribes. And so they said the tribes should not be treated as sovereign, but as wards of the government. So, in other words, saying the government is responsible already for them, even without a treaty. And we need to go in and take care of them, treaty or no. And part of the whole thing they were pushing for to speed up the civilization of the tribes was to encourage Christianity. They thought if we can encourage Christianity, that will speed up civilization because they'll want to abandon their traditional ways of life. And then they also said agents should be moral and religious men, not just some government appointee. They need to be people who are faithful Christians, who place virtue ahead of money. And then they also insisted that whites need to be prosecuted for crimes committed against Indians, especially when they happen on the reservations, because there had been a major reluctance and unwillingness to do this before. And it just goes to show that people in the day, they just didn't care what happened to the Indians. They only cared if something bad happened to a white person. It didn't matter if something bad happened to an Indian. So in here, they're saying whites need to be prosecuted for their crimes. It's going to save us a lot of headaches if the whites get punished for this. It'll teach the whites a lesson to be better and more honest. So now they ended the treaties. Following the findings, no more treaties were made. They finalized, they ratified the treaties that had already been penned, but after that, so no more treaties. We're just going to go in and make a deal and put the Indians on reservations. But corruption is to be rooted out, and we're going to do that through fairness, and by appointing people who really value morality. If we can get people who value morality, then they won't be taking advantage of the Indians. There won't be as many issues. And they would try to, instead of automatically sending in the army whenever an issue would arise, they would try to negotiate. And I already talked about that a bit. They were going to employ honest men, people who didn't really have any previous government experience, people who weren't in it for the money. And usually these are people who ended up being from different religious congregations and denominations. I mean, such as the Quakers, the Methodists, and so on. There are a few Catholics as well. And then for the protection of the tribes, they all need to be put on reservations as soon as possible. That way they can reduce conflict, they can reduce contact, and hopefully allow for the tribes to adjust into white society as painlessly as possible. This was the behind that. So, but here's the kicker on this. Tribes who do not comply will be forced to comply. And that is where they said the army needed to come in. If tribes were unwilling to try to adjust, they would be forced. And the reasoning behind this is that they thought it's for their own good that they're forced into it. And we know now, looking on it, that no, that was the wrong-headed way to go about it, but this is what they thought needed to happen. And one of the major issues with this is that they were trying to change the Indians without ever doing anything to change the way that the whites were behaving, white civilians. There are very few instances where any whites were prosecuted for crimes committed. It was pretty much non-existent. So there were still issues with this policy. So why did they still insist on assimilation? Why were they still pushing for this? Well, they thought that if we can get them to assimilate to white society, maybe we can get them to vote. If we can educate them, we can give them their rights. They said if they do this, they can earn their way into legitimacy. And again, we look at that now and think, oh, that's crazy. That's totally wrong-headed, but that's what they believe. And you can go through and find letters that were being sent to President Grant from different religious organizations and former abolitionist organizations as well. I think it's important to talk about how after the Civil War, the abolitionists they didn't just evaporate and go away once slavery was ended. They turned their attention to other matters. One of the primary ones was Indian rights. And so this was one thing they were pushing for. They said, we need to get them civilized. We need to get them assimilated into white society through education, turn them into farmers, make them, and some would say, useful members of society. And again, Grant was okay with that. President Grant was okay because look at his friend Eli Parker. Now, the interesting thing about this is Eli Parker is serving this position and he still technically can't vote. So, there's issues here. But that's why they were doing what they did. Now, jumping back a bit, and I talked about this earlier. So, for more reasons why they were pushing assimilation. So again, early on in colonization, you have people from England and other countries arriving, and they're setting up these boundaries to try and keep the natives and the whites separate. They push the natives on the other side of that boundary. But what happened? The whites would cross it. And so they'd make a new line. Okay, that's now the permanent Indian frontier. They push the tribes to cross it. Well, what happens again? Seminole, Texas. Now that permanent Indian frontier is not looking so permanent. But the thing that really blows the permanent Indian frontier out of the water, settlement of Oregon, they really blew it up. And so based on the past, is that whites do not follow the laws. It's impossible to stop them from encroaching on Indian lands. So we need to get the tribes assimilated. So now what was the public perception of the policy? Of course, out here in the West, it wasn't looked on so favorably. California papers here in Oregon, they were really negative towards it. But papers in the East, such as this one, showing President Grant getting an Indian man dressed as a white man and taking away all of his things. This might look rather cartoonish, but Thomas Nast, the guy who did this drawing, was all for it. This was actually a pro peace policy cartoon here. And here's another one that's really interesting, came out about this time. So this is called Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving Dinner. And if you look in the bottoms, it says, come one, come all, free and equal. And let's zoom in on this a little bit. So look at the cake there. It says self-governance, universal suffrage. Look who's sitting right behind the cake there. So this is something saying, yeah, this is the right way to go, to give everybody the ability to vote, have self-governance, to be citizens. And so another interesting thing about this is that this was a fairly progressive cartoon for the time. Because you notice at the table and sitting at that Thanksgiving table, the universal suffrage table, are not just men, but women. There's people of all races. There's African Americans, there's Muslims, there's Asians. People of all races are sitting at this table and sharing this feast and the benefits of full rights. Another interesting thing is you look up here on the wall, and who's it have as the three great presidents? Lincoln, Washington, and Grant. Grant was looked on very favorably for many years. And the only reason why his reputation among whites really went south is because of Southern propaganda in the latter end of Reconstruction. But Grant was considered to be one of the great presidents and heroes in America. So moving on. Now, what did the peace policy look like here? It definitely affected things here. So Alfred Meacham was appointed as superintendent of Indian Affairs. Meacham was a religious man. He was also a very staunch political supporter of General Grant. He met with President Grant, was able to get the appointment. Now, here's one thing that doesn't get talked about very often. They're still trying to figure out, okay, what's going to be better, civilian leadership or military leadership on the reservations? And so they temporarily put the Klamath Agency under charge of the military. That's where you get a guy named O.C. Knapp showing up. And so Lindsay Applegate, who had been the agent on the reservation, is removed. And O.C. Knapp, an officer from Fort Klamath, is installed as the agent. Now, the letter that I have there on the right, you can't really see on this, but that's a letter telling Lindsay Applegate, okay, pack up your stuff, you're done. And if you look at the person who wrote it, Eli S. Parker. So Parker is definitely having a hand in what's going on here. Oh yeah, circling his name there in red. All right. Now, during the time of Knapp's leadership here at the reservation, things are not so good. The Applegates are mad. They're ticked off that they're losing their hold on things. And Knapp, he catches Ivan Applegate stealing horses from the tribes. Now, and this letter here is him saying, you have no authority to take anything from the tribes. What you are given to give to them, you must give to them. And so the Applegates, they're still ticked off. They start a smear campaign against O.C. Knapp. And they say that this guy is stealing from the tribes. He is sleeping with Indian women, taking them as concubines and abusing them. So Knapp, in the end, he gives up trying to help. And on top of things, he runs out of money. He can't do what he's trying to do. And it's pretty much like everything's being taken out of his hands. He's being lambasted in the press. Public opinion is going against him. He's trying to do what he can, but he's out of money. He can't do anything. And meanwhile, you have Captain Jack, who's now on the reservation again, saying, the Klamaths are stealing from, like, the Klamaths are treating me terrible. They're taking my stuff. Can't you do anything about it? And Knapp, in his frustration, says, no, like, go figure it out yourself. And so Jack, he takes off. And so in the ensuing years, there are 3 different agents between 1870 and 1872. So things here on the reservation are just not looking good. They're trying to find someone who can lead the reservation and help things work out, but it's just not working out. And Eli Parker himself is targeted in a smear campaign. Indian. People don't always like Indians. A lot of people don't like Indians. And so they accuse him of fraud and theft, of stealing supplies that are meant for the tribes. And even though he is exonerated from all those accusations, he's frustrated and resigns. He gives up, says, I'm out of this. And also here on the reservation, Meacham is removed, and he's replaced by a man who was a newspaper editor named Thomas O'Neill. O'Neill doesn't really have any experience working with the tribes. Completely inexperienced and doesn't know what to do. So O'Neill, instead of trying to negotiate to bring Captain Jack back as Meacham had once done, O'Neill writes a letter to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs and says, we're getting all these complaints from settlers that the Modocs are down there causing issues. And he said, what should I do about it? And the Commissioner of Indian Affairs only knows really what O'Neill's telling him. And in response, he said that you can take care of the Modocs peaceably if you possibly can, forcibly if you must. Like, deal with them, get them back on the reservation. They must come back. But things are quickly spiraling out of control. O'Neill decides to send soldiers. He doesn't try to negotiate, just sends the soldiers. So on top of all this, O'Neill sends Ivan Applegate to get the soldiers to move on Captain Jack's village. But remember what Ivan Applegate just got caught doing not that long ago? He had been stealing from them. So what do you think the Modocs really think of this guy? And what do you think his chances for success really are? So they go down there, and but we have to remember that all of this was kind of going against the orders of the army. General Canby had said, okay, we're not going to just go down there and attack the village and get them back. General Canby's plan was to get as many soldiers from the region as he possibly can, and then just surround the village and try and get things to try and get the Modocs back to the reservation without any bloodshed. Just overawe them with force and get them to surrender. But the officer support plan was act without any kind of authorization, without authorization from Canby, without authorization from their commander at Camp Warner. They take 2 few men and they get into the fight on Lost River. And so later on, the army is repelled at the stronghold, and Grant, not wanting more bloodshed, decides to try and end the war through negotiation. Remember, that was one of the main parts of the peace policy. Try and negotiate ends to these things without bloodshed. So let's talk about the Peace Commission a little bit. This is Columbus Delano, Grant's Secretary of the Interior. He and Grant meet and decide that that's the way to go, to assign a peace commission to go and deal with the issues. And okay, so among those selected were Alfred Meacham, Reverend Eliezer Thomas, Leroy Dyer. Dyer was the agent. Also selected for this was Jesse Applegate. He ended up kind of recusing himself from that. But they thought, okay, Meacham has experience. He'll help us with that. He's brought Captain Jack back to the reservation before. Maybe we can make headway with that. And Canby is assigned to be in charge of the commission, work in conjunction with them. But the problem with the commission is that what authority do they really have? And the answer is none. They can't make any promises. All they can really do is try and talk the Modocs back on the reservation. They can't offer them a new reservation. They can't promise them anything. So now, one thing that is often forgotten in the history anymore is that the idea of peace commissions had worked before. It wasn't the first time. General Oliver O. Howard, the one Army general, had negotiated the surrender of Cochise in Arizona, and for a time it brought peace. So looking back on this, it's something that had worked. It wasn't a new idea. It was something that had paid off. So the probability is that they expected that this would work. And meanwhile, Grant gives his second inaugural address. And he says here, and sorry, I'm going to read the whole thing because it's all interesting. I'm not, but he says, my efforts in the future will be directed by a humane course to bring the Aborigines, the Indians of the country, under the benign influences of education and civilization. It is either this or war of extermination. Wars of extermination engaged in by people pursuing commerce and all industrial pursuits are expensive, even against the weakest people, and are demoralizing and wicked. Our superiority of strength and advantages of civilization should make us lenient toward the Indian. Wrong inflicted upon him should be taken into account and the balance placed to his credit. The moral view of the question should be considered, and the question asked, cannot the Indian be made a useful, productive member of society by proper teaching and treatment? If the effort is made in good faith, we will stand better before the civilized nations of the earth and in our own consciences for having made it. So Grant, he's still pushing for this. He still believes that they're doing the right thing. And we notice that things. Public opinion is still like undecided in some ways, but it's really starting to shift in favor of the Modocs and towards the peace policy. The public wants peace. And so Grant is getting letters from individuals saying, oh, leave the Modocs at rest. It's not their fault. It's the fault of jealous and thieving whites. You have a newspaper man who goes and visits the stronghold in February, and he says, I think they, or the Modocs, have been badly treated, and the origin of the war can easily be traced to a few Oregonians. So sympathies are really with the Modocs here and with the peace policy. But we know what happens in April. They hadn't counted on any kind of assassination attempt or peace talks really going awry. And this changes everything, not only in terms of public opinion, but in terms of how the peace policy is now approached. General Sherman, the commanding general of all the armies of the United States, wrote to General Schofield, the commander in the region here of the Department of the Pacific, and says, the president now sanctions the most severe punishment of the Modocs, and I hope to hear that they have met the doom they so richly have earned by their insolence and perfidy. And so Grant has pivoted. This takes Grant off. Canby was a friend of Grant. Later on, Grant spoke with a reporter in somewhat of a way to try and clarify his viewpoint on all this now, and also in an effort to try and shore up the peace policy. He says the peace policy, which has been abused and condemned, which strictly provides for the stern punishment of Indians when circumstances warrant it. But innocent tribes should not be visited with punishment on account of the treachery of some particular one, nor should the peace policy entire be pronounced against for failure in a single instance. So he's saying, even though things haven't worked out here, we still need to keep trying. Don't lose faith in this policy. It'll still work in the long run. And even though Grant had really changed his stance on the position of the Modocs, he's once again getting letters from people who are saying leniency, leniency. And so he decides to listen to them here. And so Lucretia Mott, she's one of the, if you know your abolitionist history, she's one of the greats in the era of abolitionism and women's rights. She calls General Sherman's comments revengeful and unjust, and saying that this war is being fought against innocent people, especially the women and children. They're not responsible for the acts of their leaders who killed Canby. You can't just go in and punish all of them. So she asks for a merciful delay in such summary punishment has been advised by Sherman. So President Grant then forwards that letter on to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Secretary Delano, and says, in relation to the Modoc trouble, one urges delay in such summary punishment has been advised in the telegram of General Sherman. So Grant is really starting to back off. He's cooling off on this. But he's taking a beating in the press. So the Missouri Republican, these are ones that are in the South, of course, whose opinion towards President Grant, his policies are already negative. But they say, oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself here. It's the Commissioner of Indian Affairs talking with the reporter. And the reporter asks, what effect will the assassination of General Canby have on the peace policy? And the commissioner responds, well, popular feeling is very much against that policy now on account of the massacre, and it will be set back in some degree in consequence. Well, in some degree. So the San Francisco Examiner says that in all his messages to Congress, talking about Grant, since he has assumed the role of philanthropist towards the Aborigines, he has advocated the peace policy and urged that leniency should be exercised towards the instinctive scalpers of white men whenever they fall into their clutches and their savage predilections could be gratified without danger to themselves. The blood of General Canby and the other victims of Modoc treachery is on Grant's skirts. And in here, you even have something from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper showing Grant having an uneasy sleep. He's in bed sweating. An incident in Louisiana with massacres of blacks down there was weighing heavily on him. But outside the window, you have a Modoc Indian leaning in. On the floor next to him, there's a paper that says Massacre of the Modocs. So this is something that he's really being taken to task for now, the president is. Now, the war concludes in 1873 with, but as Grant, as a secondary portion of Grant's policy comes in. If they're not going to comply, that's when you bring in the fist. And so the Army resumes operations, and eventually the Captain Jack and the other Modocs are captured, and 4 of them, including Captain Jack, are executed. And the criticism is still pouring in here. Some papers said, well, it's all moral corruption within the Indian Department. And for example, the North Carolina Gazette, this is one that was really anti-Republican. It says, the hanging of Captain Jack is the end of Grant's peace policy. So, and then the Nashville Union of American said, this is not a pleasant story to relate, nor one to be read by Americans with pride and satisfaction. It illustrates the kind of treatment systematically pursued toward the original occupants of our soil. And it says the peace policy consists of swindling the Indians and taxpayers alike for the benefit of the meanest and most rascally of our national rings, being like the rings of the criminal rings of corruption. Saying the peace policy is just benefiting them. They're saying it's just more of the same, more corruption. So now let's talk about the exile here. So President Grant directed that the Modocs be transferred down to Indian territory as soon as possible. And one thing we need to remember is that well, here it says, it is desirable that these orders should not be made public any sooner than is necessary. Now, why do you think that is? We like to think that the exile of the Modocs was something that was done completely out of hatred for them and anger. But Grant was getting letters from the same people who had been calling for leniency for the tribes, saying, get them out of Oregon. The Oregonians are treating them bad. Not going to get a fair shake in Oregon. The people in Oregon already want to hang them. Get them away from Oregon. And so I think there's 2 sides to the exile story that we need to talk about. Of course, it was awful for the Modocs. It was a horrible experience. Many of them died. And it was one of the most unjust things to ever happen in the whole era. But it was something that people who desired peace really thought would be beneficial for them. And so one reason why it wasn't supposed to be made public is that the Oregonians did not want the Modocs to leave. They wanted them to stay so that they could prosecute them. And so there's 2 reasons for not making it public. You don't want the Modocs to try and break out again. And you don't want the Oregonians to make a fuss. So now, what were the effects of on the peace policy and all this? So, as I was showing, public confidence in this policy was evaporated. It was gone, and so people now kind of a knee-jerk reaction is to just wage war. That's what we're going to do from now on. On top of things, the Grant administration was embarrassed by all this. They did not want that future embarrassment. They just wanted to get things done, get it out of the way, and prevent these embarrassments from happening again. And so that meant that future attempts to negotiate, they're kind of far and few between. There we go. I guess it doesn't make it matter, but some attempts to negotiate with tribes were attempted in the future, but never with the same results, and never with the same kind of anxiousness to get it done. Kind of done half-heartedly. So, and because of that, this failure of the peace policy in the case of the Modoc War led really to increased troubles for other tribes. The government was much less willing to try and negotiate, and much less willing to try and work with the tribes. The military force became the go-to method now to secure cooperation with the tribes. And other tribes, well, I kind of talked about that. So it's something that is really coming back, inviting the Grant administration, having a horrible effect on Grant's desire for peaceful solutions to all this. And the ones who suffer the most are the tribes. The Grant administration does not put their foot down to try and make things peaceful. And so it really goes back to them as well. We're not trying to make it work despite this failure here. So let's talk about why in the end did it fail. So first and foremost, the government was unable to control its citizens. Even if the Modocs had gone back down to their homeland after signing the treaty, if the whites hadn't caused issues and made up stories about the Modocs being hostile, things would have been different. The government would not control white settlement. They refused to do anything about any wrongs committed against Modocs or any other tribe. And many Americans were just, we can say it nowadays, but we can say a lot of them were downright racist. They did not want anything to do with the Indians. They did not care about Indians. They could care less about them, even if they were killed off. Well, whatever. And so you had an American public that was just unwilling and uncaring to go with the tribes in any fair way. And one important thing too, the tribes, they don't want to cooperate with this. Why would they want to give up their homelands? Why would they want to give up their freedom, their culture? They don't want to be assimilated. They want to live the way they always have. And so the cooperation of any kind was just not there in the end from either side. And so it required more time and patience than the public, the natives, or any government officials could really do. And so we look at events like this and the Modoc War and national policy, it makes you wonder, in terms of the direction of the country and policy, who really is driving the bus? Is it people back in Washington, D.C. who are making all these policy decisions? Or is it people on the ground where things are actually happening? What's a more important factor in all this? And so I would argue that Washington's best or worst intentions are often sidelined by actions that happen out with the public, and so the peace policy was something that was created with good intentions, and we look at it now and say, yeah, that was the wrong way to go about things, but intent is important. We really have to look at that intent. And so, but it collapsed. That policy collapsed almost entirely because of events like the Modoc War. And so we have to look at the Modoc War as something that's not just regionally significant, but nationally significant then, and had repercussions that affected national Indian policy up until very recently, and even to the present. And so remember that the Modoc War is not just some forgotten local thing that happened a long time ago that we could move past. It's something that is significant. It is impactful. And one of the most significant events to happen in the late 1800s in the United States. So With that, I'll go ahead and close, but thank you